All right, for 12.4, we're going to be learning about simplifying rational expressions. A rational expression is an expression that can be written as a ratio of two polynomials where the denominator is not zero. Basically, what we got going on here is a polynomial divided by a polynomial. Generally, there's going to be an x in the denominator. There's going to be x's in the numerator. You're going to see things like this. The first thing we're going to learn about is what's called an excluded value. An excluded value is what makes the denominator zero, because we cannot have that. So there are values that make the function undefined. So in this case, we do x minus 3 equals 0, x equals 3, or x minus 3 can't be 0. So the excluded value for this function here would be 3. Always find excluded values first. All right, let's practice this with a few problems here. Don't even look at the numerator. The numerator does not matter for any of these problems at all. We just want to find the excluded value. So we're going to set 10x equal to 0. 10x cannot be 0. Divide by 10, divide by 10, x cannot be 0. For the second one, 2y plus 14 cannot be equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 14 from both sides. 2y cannot be negative 14, divided by 2, and y cannot be equal to negative 7. All right, now we get into some quadratics here. B squared minus 9 cannot be equal to 0. I'm going to use, since this is a quadratic, I'm going to use square roots because I'm going to add 9 to both sides. Because b equals 0. Square root both sides. V cannot be equal to positive or negative 3. Both of those values are your excluded values. And finally, we get into 8w squared plus w plus 5. I'm going to use the the quadratic formula, negative b, so a equals 8, b equals 1, c equals 5. I'm going to see if there's any values that will make this function equal to 0. So this cannot be equal to 0. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared, 1 squared is 1, minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a, all divided by 16. If I look at this part right here, we have 1 take away 20 times 8 is 160. That is the square root of negative 159. Does not exist. So this one, there's no values that will make this 0. So there's no excluded values for D. So that's kind of interesting because there's no values that will make that equal to 0. Then there's a few more questions here. I'll go over these kind of quickly because they are good to see. 3x minus 5, you just set that equal to 0. Solve that one. This one here, you'd use the quadratic formula. This one is as well. I can tell you right away that that one will not have an excluded value. You do the same thing I just did. I'm going to check into number 3 though, negative b. So a is, again, you can ignore the tops of these. You don't even need to worry about those. A equals 2, b equals negative 5, c equals negative 12. Let's see, negative b. Sorry about that. That's a negative 5 there. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 12, all divided by 2a, that'd be 4. So 5 plus or minus square root of 25, let's see, I'm going to grab my calculator here. 8 times 12 is 96. And that gives me 121. The square root of 121 is 11. So 5 plus 11 divided by 4. And then 5 minus 11 divided by 4. Just going back to solving a quadratic. That's 16 divided by 4 is 4. And 5 minus 11 is negative 6 divided by 4 is negative 3 halves. Those would be your excluded values right there. So using our quadratic formula. And finally, m squared minus 4. This one you could again use solving square roots like I did above. So we'll leave it at that there. All right, now let's actually get into solving these guys here. No, I shouldn't say actually solving them. We're simplifying them because they're expressions, not equations. What we're doing is we're going to factor. Step number 1, factor. Step number 2, reduce. Common factors. Okay, so for example, if we take a look at this one here, AC divided by BC. A times C divided by B times C. C divided by C equals 1, which is why we're reducing here. When we take a look at this one here, factor the GCF out. 2x plus 4, I can divide that by 2, and it ends up with 2 times x plus 2. And if I take a look at 3x plus 6, I can factor out the GCF there, which is 3, and you end up with 3 times x plus 2. And this is this times this, x plus 2 divided by x plus 2 is 1, so your answer is 2 over 3. So here we go. Alright, and it says state the excluded values, so I'm going to put the excluded values up on top. So 0 would be my excluded value for this one because 2r cannot be equal to 0, so r can't be equal to 0. Alright, r divided by 2 times r. So always separate your terms with a dot for this. Going to reduce those. My answer is 1 over 2. Alright, here I have 5 times x over 5 times x plus 2. The excluded value for this one is negative 2. If you put negative 2 into the denominator for x, it's going to make it undefined. 5 divided by 5 is 1, and the answer is x over x plus 2. You cannot, this is the hardest part about this, you cannot divide the x divided by x there because it's x divided by x plus 2. Those are two different terms, so please be careful here there. For part C, m can be equal to 0, so if you plug in 0 on the bottom there, it's going to give you 0. I'm going to factor out the GCF here out of the top, which would be 6m squared. So I have 6m cubed minus 12m squared. I'm going to divide by 6m squared, divide by 6m squared. That's going to give me 6m squared on the outside times m minus 2 over 18. I should put a dot there. 18 times m squared. So here I have an m squared and an m squared. 6 divided by 18 is 1 over 3. So on the top I have m minus 2. I don't need the 1 there. And then on the bottom I have a 3. Last one, we have y divided by negative y plus 7. Please note how I switched around the order. I always want the leading coefficient to be, I want it to go in descending order. And I know we normally would factor out this negative 1 here. We learned how to do that earlier in here. This will come into play. But there's nothing there to reduce. You cannot reduce that y, divide the y and the y, because it's y and y minus 7. And let's get into a couple more problems here. Excluded value for the first one. A cannot be equal to 0. So I have 4 times a to the third, or 22 times a to the second, or a to the sixth. Okay, so 4 divided by 22 is 2 divided by 11. And then a to the third divided by a to the sixth is a to the third on the denominator portion of it. This one here, c cannot be equal to negative 5. 2c divided by 2 times c divided by c plus 5. Again, you cannot reduce those c's there because it's 2 times c, and then c plus 5 is together. For number 7, 3s plus 12 cannot be equal to 0, so that would mean s cannot be equal to negative 4 if you subtract the 4 and divide by the 3. I'm going to factor out the GCF here. I'm going to factor out 2s out of the numerator. If I factor out 2s, it becomes s plus 4. If I factor out a 3 out of the denominator, it becomes s plus 4. Interesting. So I have 2 times s plus 4. I have 3 times s plus 4. The s plus 4s are the same, so I can reduce those. I have 2s divided by 3 for my final answer. On the bottom, I'm going to factor out I'm going to factor first to find my excluded value. So I'm going to take out an 8x squared out of there, and I'm left with x plus 2. So x cannot be equal to 0, and x cannot be equal to negative 2. Now I'm going to reduce. I have 8 times x over 8 times x squared times x plus 2. The 8 divided by 8 is 0, or sorry, 1. X divided by x squared is x on the bottom. So my final answer, there's a 1 left on top. There's nothing there, but there is a 1. And then on the bottom, I have x times x plus 2. And you can leave it in factored form. There you go. As you can see, these problems are fairly complex. Here's your assignment. Bring any questions, and I will gladly help you with these. Thank you guys for tuning in.